Welcome back. Well, you're at home with Jim and Joy, and today we have another outstanding, wonderful human being with us, and we are privileged to have Olivia Gans Turner, who is the director of American Victims of Abortion, which is an outreach from the National Right to Life Committee. So, Miss Olivia, thank you so much for taking this great invitation and coming all the way down to Alabama to see us.
Oh, Joy, this is a true delight for me. It's really a pleasure to be in this happy, wonderful place with you two.
Well, good. Well, I want you to tell our audience, our family at home, how and why and when did Olivia get involved in the pro-life movement?
I was just saying,
Jim.
right before we went on, you know, I really want our audience to know you really are a keeper of the history of the movement, especially as regards post-abortion healing work. It's a real privilege to have you on, so
Thank
go
you
right
for
ahead.
acknowledging that. I appreciate that. It's an honorable history to be able to share with others. My experience in the movement started, unfortunately, because of my own abortion experience. And in a nutshell, I was like so many of my peers. I was a college student. I had kind of been taught by all the wise professors to disregard what I had been given as a young woman and as a child. I was raised in a Catholic home, raised by pro-life parents, and sort of gradually found myself being told, well, you can find your own rules, find your own way. And I met a young man, similar background, similar experiences, and we, quote, found our own way. But that path led us to a pregnancy outside of marriage, when neither one of us really was prepared for that. And unfortunately, he was not prepared to be a father, and I was not brave enough to be a strong mother. And I allowed myself to be led by his fear, as well as my own, to looking towards abortion. And we ended up doing something that in my circumstance now, I realize, you know, the Lord takes everything and sort of creates his own storyline out of our lunacy. And in order for me to proceed to the point where I actually did have an abortion in February of 1981, I ended up going to 4 different abortion providers. And those individuals, one by one, including a Planned Parenthood office, told me that I was stupid, childish, immature, and irrational to not realize how sensible in our situation it would be to have an abortion. So without his support, being able to be manly enough to be the father of our child, and without any courage within myself to stand up and protect my child, I was so easily manipulated by not 1, not 2, but 4 different abortion providers. And so when people say to me, well, that was just your bad experience, I say, 4 times? 4 times? I was made to feel like a fool because I even voiced any concerns whatsoever about whether or not abortion was the only course I could follow. Because I did ask those questions, and many of my peers have done the same. So it's an interesting thing that, oddly enough, a process that took us a while. We had to find somebody who wouldn't put me in the hospital, somebody we could afford, all that. And it means now that it's almost impossible when I do an event in public, a TV thing, that someone can say, or a reporter can say to me, well, you just had a bad experience. It's not like others. I don't think so. I think what I experienced is tragically the norm, where women are told that they can't cope with their pregnancies, that the only sensible thing to do is to pay someone to kill their child, and that is sadly what I did on February 27th, 1981. And so, for me, that was that moment, the beginning. It was not until several months later that I actually confronted the reality of what I'd done. He and I broke up, the baby's father and I broke up within 3 months afterwards, which is clinically what we know now. 60 to 90 days after an initial abortion experience, many unmarried couples do split up. It's almost impossible to look at each other without thinking about the baby you're not holding. And that silent secret that you don't talk about is there. So we broke up, he walked out, and I never saw him again. In September of that year, I went to my grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary. And at that event, surrounded by cousins and relatives, brothers and sisters, and my beloved grandparents, I'm the oldest of all the grandchildren, firstborn grandchild, you know what that means, you know, oh, we're special, those first grandchildren. And I looked at those dear grandparents and I thought, they don't know that this month, perhaps this very day, their first great-grandchild might have been born, because my baby was due that September. And that was the stop point. But unfortunately, that didn't lead me back to the time of healing. That led me down that dark time. And that dark time where I wasn't sleeping, and I was spending nights crying, and I had broken away I stopped going to college. I just was unable to function. I had suffered from anxiety attacks. I would sit and I would rock. If I had to go somewhere, I'd have to get control of myself. And it was classic post-abortion syndrome. But you have to understand, in 1981, no one was talking about this in that context. No one had a name for this experience.
There was no terminology.
Exactly. There was nobody bringing forward the idea that this is what was happening. A few stalwart pro-lifers knew, some doctors and physicians said, a woman can't go through this without experiencing something. But a clinical definition or comprehension had not yet come to the fore. So I was experiencing what we now call a post-abortion syndrome or post-traumatic experience without a name.
And you're alone in this?
Alone. My parents knew nothing. My brothers and sisters knew nothing. I was living again in my parents' house. I think probably the most crushing day was the very day that the baby died. When I'd come home from the abortionist's office, I was in my parents' house. My brothers and sisters wanted me to come downstairs that evening to watch The Wizard of Oz. You know, I had little brothers and sisters. And they wanted their big sister to come watch The Wizard of Oz. And I didn't think at that time, that day, my baby will never go to college. My baby will never get married. I thought, my child will never know who the Wizard of Oz is. Will never have a childhood. And I shut down again. Every step, see, one of the things that happens with the post-abortion experience is the trauma is so huge, the only way that the mind can cope is really to just kind of collapse down on it, to keep clamping down. So even as those thoughts entered my mind, I couldn't let my 5-year-old baby sister know what had just happened that afternoon. So you push it away. And this is why we see so many women taking years to come out of the shadows, because the only way our brains can cope with some major traumas, and abortion is that kind of trauma, is to push it as far away as possible and basically deny that you're feeling the things you're feeling.
Well, did your parents or anyone in your family notice or recognize any change in you?
Oh, Joy, they did. My mother knew that something was dreadfully wrong, particularly after the baby's father and I split up. She knew, I mean, I dated other fellas, you know, broken up before, but I was so unable to cope, and I didn't want to go back to school, and I wasn't able to leave the house without this enormous crisis experience. And she said, there's something different here. There's something different. Well, it was coming on October, that following October. I couldn't take it anymore. I'd reached that point, as so many women do, where you start bottoming out. Now, I did not ever reach a point where I actually completely did think about ending my life, but I did realize I'm not sleeping. If I slept, I would wake up, I would feel the pain. I could not cope with the anxiety, the stress. The enormity of what had happened was so pressing on me that I started doing something my mother had told me to do many years before. Picked up the rosary my grandfather had given me at my first communion, and I started praying it. I wasn't a member of the church again. I had slipped away from the church. I used it like, if you will, a mantra. I just repeat it. My mother used to say, if you can't sleep at night, the Blessed Mother will help you pray your rosary. Well, the mother that she is knew exactly what I needed. First, I needed a couple of good nights' sleep. So I slept, and I prayed that rosary more and more and more, and she eventually said, I have an idea. Why don't you come talk to my son? And that led me to the desire to find a way to reconnect with my child. And I knew enough from the background I had been given. This is why I say never fear to parents. If you've given your children a roadmap that is clear, they'll find their way. And my parents had taught me that around the Eucharistic table was the communion of saints. That is where I would find my child. But I also knew the enormity of what I had done meant that I was probably separated from that. But in her kindness, I know now that the Blessed Mother was drawing me to find that reconciliation, that mercy that the Pope is talking about so much, and the healing. And I found that in the good fortune of a neighborhood priest who was remarkably understanding, a young priest, happened to be a Jubilee year. And so he was able to absolve my sins. Now remember, these were years ago, before the priests, many priests had faculties to lift this sin, which the Pope has been talking about this year, giving worldwide priests that faculty. So this was a huge step for me to even approach a priest. But that was the beginning of finding out that there was mercy, that there was wholeness, and the rest of the journey followed after that.
So you made confession?
Yes, I went to confession, went to Mass the following week and was able to go to communion, and I knew at that time that I was united with my child. This was before, obviously, John Paul II had started writing about his impressions that our children lost through abortion, and many mothers find such such solace in Evangelium Vitae, where the Pope talks to us directly about this extraordinary phenomenon where he believed with all his heart that our children are intercessors, that they are close to Christ in his heart, in heaven, and they are drawing us back to this point of mercy and this point of healing and forgiveness.
Right.
So it's a huge journey.
Oh, it's an awesome journey, and the beauty, you know, how you articulated it so, and go into confession. What courage, because that was, then you were going to reveal the secret. I mean, you were going to reveal the secret.
I'll tell you what, Joy, I tell people this all the time. There's many, many, many wonderful post-abortion programs that the church has since that time begun to develop. Mostly, I think, because of those of us who in the early days started sort of talking and approaching our priests and our pastors and saying, we have a problem here. But I didn't want to go to a face-to-face confession. I wanted Christ and only Christ. But I knew I had to talk to the priest to be close to Christ. So I asked over the telephone anonymously, can I come to confession at your parish, and can I meet you inside the confessional? So he came. He said, you come at 10 after. I will already be inside. And I went. And it was, for me, and this is important, I think. I think some women they find benefit in some of the gradual programs that allow women to work to a point. Perhaps they've worked with a confessor as part of a larger group program, and they know Father and they're comfortable, and that's wonderful, that's great. But there will be some of us who, as you say, the power, the mother knows how grave this thing is. You don't need to have been raised Catholic or Baptist or anything to know the gravity of what's occurred. I've met women who have absolutely no church background of any kind who can feel the enormity. And in our being we know this. But at that moment, I needed Christ. So for me, I think it's important that we not put pressure on women to do things in an open way. If that particular woman would be benefited by a more private phenomenon, let her find her way in the quiet and the privacy of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will have more of the beautiful conversation with precious Olivia. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Olivia, we're sharing with you, and this is a little bit different than it was in 1980, isn't it? I don't just mean the marches and so much publicity about things now.
Oh, yeah.
Compared to 1980, and almost inevitably at all of these marches and rallies, we now have women coming forward that say, you know, I regret my abortion, and they're sharing about it in the year 2016. But what was it like in 1980?
In 1980, 81, 82, when I came out, there was nothing like this. The pro-life movement, I have to say, with absolute gratitude, that as I look back, the pro-life movement did always hold a candle, if you will, aloft in the darkness. There were human beings, men and women, pro-life leaders, who knew that we had been damaged, that this was a dreadful thing to happen to a woman, that abortionists were lying to us, that the physical experience of the abortions were horrible, that the aftermath was definitely causing some complications, but nobody was naming it. There was no identification of how did that take shape, what did that look like, how much damage was there. And so, but all the same, they were trying to talk to people. People like Dr. Wanda Franz, who was at that time vice president of the National Right to Life Committee, herself an adolescent psychologist, professor of adolescent psychology, knew that adolescents who went through abortions were dramatically damaged and changed by an abortion in their early teens, or late teens for that matter, because developmentally it was so harmful to them. So I have to give credit to the pro-lifers who did their best to make their voices heard that we were being harmed. But I went, my abortion was 81. Right. In 1982, I had come back to the church at that point. Right. But I had not told anyone in my circle, family, friends. I was still, if you will, in my own closet of secrecy. And I went with my family, who, as I said, my parents were staunch Catholics, members of their local pro-life organization. And I say this because I think pro-life families need to know, you know,
it can happen.
Unhappy things can creep into any family. And we went together as a family to the National Right to Life Convention, which that year was held in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where my family was living, right? And at that convention, I was walking around very on eggshells. You know, how did these people respond? I knew that I'd been told I was stupid, childish, foolish by people at Planned Parenthood. I'd been told by the Planned Parenthood person, the counselor there, that I should probably do what the baby's father wanted us to do because I was not capable of thinking rationally because I was pregnant.
Yeah.
So much for, like, you know,
Right.
uplifting women.
Right, right.
So I knew how they treated me. And I wasn't sure what I'd get from these pro-lifers. Would they tar and feather a woman if they found out where I'd been?
Right.
And I started to see that. But the most singular thing that happened that day, Jim, when you guys talk about history, Joy, that was the day that something significant happened. That year, June of that year, at that convention, Dr. Vincent Rue, who is a pioneer in the field of post-abortion damage and trauma, he spoke for the first time ever at a National Right to Life convention. And he laid out a diagnostic criteria. He, at that point, was the director of the Sir Thomas More Family Therapy Centers, marriage therapy program in Southern California. And he was seeing couples coming into his practice, husbands and wives, where there was an abortion in the history. Maybe they were together as a couple, maybe before they met each other, either the husband or the wife. And these abortions were actually never spoken about, and yet they appeared to keep coming up.
And was infecting and affecting the marriage, right?
Exactly, exactly. And yet very few therapists would ever ask that question. You know, they might say, well, how many pregnancies have you, how many children, blah, blah, blah. And she might say, well, I had a miscarriage and I had an abortion when I was 18. And they go, oh, well, that's okay. And they blow over it. But he didn't. And he started asking questions. And he came up with a diagnostic criteria. And he spoke at the convention about what he was seeing, patterns that he was watching in the lives of men and women that he was working with. After the session, about 4 other women and myself huddled, as you do at these things, to try to pick the brain of the speaker. What none of us realized was all of us were women from different parts of the country who'd come to that convention that year with our own abortion stories. And we spent the rest of that convention in a hotel room going, do you remember this? Did that happen to you? Oh my gosh, I cry every night. I mean, we found
a community.
A common, shared, horrible, but real experience.
What was birthed?
What was, exactly. It was birthed at that convention. That led to the very first post-abortion peer-to-peer support program in the country. It was known as Women Exploited by Abortion. Some people watching may remember WEBA. And that organization was our effort to try to reach each other. And it gave the pro-life movement the first actual physical, identifiable people who had the courage to speak. This does not necessarily mean we were all ready to speak or that it was healthy for us to do so. And I will say in the early days, as we started to come from different parts of the country and find each other, there was a bit of a disconnect with the amount of damage that was probably in our lives still, and the desire to go innocently, I think. Many in the movement said, we have this wonderful woman, she lives in our town, she goes to my church, and she says she's had an abortion. Let's have her speak in front of everyone.
Oh, I've been there.
Oh, you know what I'm
people. Oh, yeah, you're just like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? You're feeling spined. She's not ready, you're not, and the audience isn't ready.
And the poor darling stood up there and many times would cry buckets of tears because really what she was saying was, can you help me mend my broken heart? Exactly. So this was before we understood how things happened in this, and really identifying abortion as a post-traumatic stress disorder, kind of post-traumatic PTSD kind of response. Well, you would no more take a Vietnam veteran that says, hello, I shot 1 million children in a small village, now I want to go tell everybody about it. You say, well, let's sit down and talk about that before you do that.
Is the key with post-traumatic stress, is the key with that near-death or death experiences? Is that key, that's central to it?
It does seem to be very much a part of it, yeah.
Because that seems to be the connection with war. It's when one gets close to death or has participated or it's happening near you that there's a trauma that takes place.
Right, there is a big part of that, Jim. The trauma has to be something so earth-shattering that we are not prepared to cope with it. And for instance, in the case of abortion, if you take a, or say you have a child sitting on a city street block and he's 7 years old and a gang drive-by shooting occurs and his big brother is standing over him and he's shot and falls right on. I mean, what 7-year-old would be prepared for that? Well, of course that child is going to be highly traumatized by the horror of that. Abortion is the same phenomenon. And you take, say, a 16-year-old girl and you say to her, you now have the complete authority and power to make a life and death decision about your own child. All you have to do is say yes or no. and we will eliminate this pregnancy for you. And so I mean, do you remember, was it kindergarten when they taught us how to make life and death decisions over another human being? I mean, was it 8th grade? When did they teach you that? And the point is they don't.
Right.
So none of us actually have the kind of life skills, if one would call it that, to be prepared for the enormity of having life and death power over your own child.
Yeah.
It's a horrendous thing to think about, and yet we say this is acceptable, this is normal, this is something that affirms women's power.
This is it's gonna empower you as a woman and set you free
Right.
from this burden,
Right.
so you can get on with your life, because this is just gonna hold you back.
And it's a nightmare.
Right.
And you know, you and I know that. We've talked to so many, we've lived with so many, and your heart breaks, because the real power that women have is, okay, maybe this baby's come at a time that we would not say is opportune.
Yeah.
Something's going on. John just lost his job. They've got 3 kids to feed already. You know, Mary Lou lives with an abusive person. You know, I'm 14 and my parents will be highly disappointed. Those would not be opportune moments to be pregnant in many people's eyes. But it is the very capacity of women to rise above, beyond, and through the complexity of the pregnancy, the circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. Not even the pregnancy, but the circumstances that surround the pregnancy.
Yeah.
I often tell audiences when I speak at universities, it's not being pregnant that is the problem for the woman. It's the circumstances
That's
that
right.
surround the timing of that pregnancy.
Let's take this email.
Okay, we're gonna go straight to an email. I had an abortion over 20 years ago, and I've always felt like I didn't have the right to be upset about it.
No.
I cannot forget this life I never got to know. I cannot forget this life I snuffed. I don't even know if it was a boy or a girl, because I was too early in the pregnancy. So I simply named my baby Sam. Can I ever truly receive forgiveness from God and from Sam? This is from Catherine from Florida.
Thank you, Catherine.
God
We're
bless you.
sorry for your loss.
Yeah, Catherine is like so many, and my heart reaches out to you, Catherine. With all my heart, I reach out to you to say that really, in truth, God is capable of forgiving everything. And more importantly, I think for those of us who have been through the abortion experience, not only will he forgive, but he actually restores.
Yes.
I think what is most amazing are the different stories I've heard from women over the years of how they have seen God restore what is lost, and in this case, our children. I mean, can I see my child? Can I hold my child who would be in her 30s right now? No, I cannot. But I have nieces and nephews who are each one in different ways significant to me. I celebrate their lives. I have been privileged to be a part of, through the work I do in the pro-life movement, I've been a part of helping several specific women have the courage to give their children life. One of those children is a little girl named Octavia. She lives in Washington, D.C. She's now a young lady, but she was named Octavia because her mother and I lost contact halfway through her pregnancy. She couldn't remember my name was Olivia. She said it was a name that began with an O, so Octavia is really...
Maybe you should change your name.
I should change my name to Octavia. Okay. So, I mean, for me, I see those blessings as God saying,
Oh, yes.
life will come from this experience.
So that's an amazing answer. Yes, God forgives, and more. You could become, as John Paul II said, like you are now, one of the most eloquent spokespersons on behalf of life. That God takes every evil, he can turn it to a good, the curse into a blessing, death to life. And so you have so much to look forward to in him.
I'd say one quick thing to Catherine's comments. Something that I think is important for people who love someone who's had an abortion, or the individual themselves who's been through an abortion, or is the dad of an aborted baby, because those fathers suffer enormously too. If you're close to somebody who's been through an abortion experience, there's no specific timetable. There's no perfect one-size-fits-all. We are as individual as our children were. We are as beloved to God now as our children were at the moment of their conception. So part of this journey of restoration is not just the restoration in his mercy and his love to acknowledge that our children are safe, they're with God, they understand, they love us through this great tragedy, and they're actually praying for us. They're actually, as John Paul says, St. John Paul points out, they're praying for us. But also that it is a discovery of what the Lord saw when he created us. Because for many of us, the abortion becomes the central moment of our life. And one of the greatest parts of this journey to find forgiveness, to find healing, is to find out, what was God thinking when he made you in the first place? What was in his mind when he said, I think it would be exciting to have Jim. I think it would be marvelous to have joy in the world. I think the world would benefit from having joy in the world. And so, you know, to discover, oh gee golly, I'm not just that horrible, tragic moment in my life. I'm something so much more exciting. And you don't even necessarily have to become a pro-life speaker to be a witness to life and see life come about. It's letting God love you the way he wanted to at that moment for the rest of your life.
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Miss Olivia. We're going to take a quick break.
And I think we've got an email that's come in during that time. Do we have it to read? I'm the kind of person who tends to get into heated emotional arguments with people about abortion. And when I talk about women who regret their abortions, a response I often get is, yeah, well, not every woman regrets her abortion. Many are happy or relieved. You can't criminalize abortion just because some people regret it. Or they say, abortion has a stigma because anti-choice radicals are brainwashing women into thinking it was a baby when it was a non-viable parasite. They wouldn't regret abortion if they knew it was just an elective procedure. How do I respond to these horrible things, Candace?
Wow, I think that's going to become more and more commonplace for folks, because one of the things that I'm very concerned about, guys, is the number of abortions that have happened in our country. Many people think that we've had 1.5 million abortions a year since 1973, the year that abortion was legalized. That's not the case. It took till the end of the 1970s for the numbers to get that high. But certainly throughout the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, the numbers were over 1.5 million a year. So that means, what does that mean? All right, we know that 43% of abortions are repeat abortions. Sadly, many women who have had one go on to have 2 or 3 abortions. Particularly if she's a teenager when she has her first, she may have more than 1 abortion because you've taught her that abortion is a problem-solving method.
Right.
So you have a problem there. But beyond that, even if you don't count in the repeat abortions, we're talking about millions upon millions of women and men in our society who have been through an abortion experience. Yeah. And in a society where we're told that this is the smart, intelligent thing to do when you're facing the problem of a pregnancy, and that the pregnancy is not a decision, a life and death decision about a living human being, but a problem to be eliminated, you've created a dynamic where we have a society, we are all surrounded by someone who's been involved in an abortion.
Right.
I think the idea that people like this email, like Candace, are talking about, you know, someone is saying, well, some women don't say they have a problem, they don't regret it, they think it was, they felt relieved after their abortion. We're going to hear more and more people saying that to people close to us. You're all going to run into it. I tell people all the time, every audience I speak to, every single person in the room, if I'm at a banquet, Joy, you asked if I do banquets. If I'm speaking at a banquet and the room is full of 500 people, I let that audience know every single one of those people knows someone intimately who has had an abortion experience. Now what that means societally and culturally, and in the context of this email, it means that you can't just stand up and say, abortion hurts women, it might give them breast cancer, it kills their baby, because you're talking to somebody who paid for an abortion when he was in college and got his girlfriend pregnant, and you know, she had one last year because her husband lost his job, and now what do you do? And so you have these extraordinary phenomenon where families are all involved in this decision. Are you telling me that my brother-in-law was a bad dude? I love my brother-in-law. Okay, so he got in trouble when he was 19 in college. He fixed it, he solved it. Are you telling me that my sister-in-law is bad because my brother's out of work? The only thing they could do was for her to have an abortion. You're telling me they're bad. And so the idea that women say, I felt relief, it's coming from, and the white people respond like, well, you guys can't criminalize it. There's legitimate reasons for abortion. When you hear people saying that to you, first make the presumption that maybe you're actually talking to somebody who's been there or knows someone who's been there. And therefore, the conversation is really about how do we rationalize and justify abortion in a society that has made abortion the #1 problem-solving process for complicated pregnancies that as a society or as families, we are not prepared to cope with. So my simple response is you've got to comprehend when people throw that at you, they're really trying to figure out how do you pro-lifers really expect me to cope with my life? What are you actually saying to me? Are you saying that I should have had this baby, but I'm relieved because I got to finish college? I don't tell you about the nights I wake up at 3 in the morning.
Right.
Remembering what never will be. I don't tell you but what it felt like. Now I'm 35 years old, I've gotten married, I've seen the ultrasound of the child I wanted, and the child on the ultrasound is perfect and beautiful and human and 2 weeks younger than the baby I aborted.
Right.
And so I'm seeing something I never was allowed to see when I made the first decision, but I can't let myself think about that. So I use the word relief. Do you guys know that when you talk to psychologists and psychiatrists, relief is not considered a positive response? If a mosquito scratches you, bites you, you're going to go like this. You're going to feel relief because the itch has stopped. You've stopped the itch. That's relief. It's neither a positive nor a negative. Relief is not seen as either or. It's simply seen as relief. So for pro-life or pro-abortion people to say to you, but many women are relieved, well, that doesn't mean they feel good about what happened. They just mean that immediate crisis seems to have been resolved, so I'm relieved about that.
It's powerful.
It's very, very deep stuff. It's a lot of stuff going on there.
But the fact is, there are so many people hurting. There's an elephant in the room. Nobody wants to talk about it. Nobody gets to lift the veil of the pain and the woundedness. We're just not going to talk about it. We're just going to stay separate from each other because you're wrong, and we don't come together and say, well, I know some women that have been hurt. I know some women, right?
That's the way to do it.
And you may not have been, but I do know some. And
I
this
think
is their thing. And then when you start doing it, it triggers, oh yeah, I got that, I got that
Right, and I
too.
think you hit the nail on the head. I think the way to really respond to that is always to be calm, to be cool, to be collected, and acknowledge that they don't know what you know. I've just laid out a lot of information that many viewers may not have ever heard, that relief is neither a positive or a negative, okay? That many people have members of their families, and they're trying to actually protect someone they love when they throw those kind of comments at you. So the way to respond is always to say, I've actually said to people who've been very intense and aggressive, very strong pro-abortion women who've come, I feel very happy that I had, I'm glad I had it. I'm glad I had at least I'm glad I had the option of having it. And I say, you know, I'm so glad that at this stage of your life you've not encountered what many of my friends and peers have. I will hope and pray that you never encountered, and I wish you all the best in your life. You go forward with, and may you never have any of those complications. But I hope you and I would both be able to agree that where the problems are coming up and are surfacing in women's lives, that we should be less fearful about actually conducting the research that will be necessary to understand how much of a problem it may or may not be. And even if it's a problem for only 10 women, wouldn't it be kinder to those 10 women to let them have the help and care they deserve than to say, it doesn't matter because it didn't happen to me?
Right. And let them get the healing and the hope they need.
So you kind of break down the walls and say, it's more about how can we be honorable to each other? I'm not going to say you're wrong, but you're not going to say that you would deny these people who are hurting the care they might be able to get, well, are you? Sort of changes the focus.
Oh yeah, it does. It changes that conversation. Okay, we have one more email. As a man, I have trouble justifying my involvement in the pro-life movement. I've been told numerous times it's not my place or my issue because I don't have a uterus. Please let women know that the men in the pro-life movement are the ones who really care about helping women. And this is Devin from Ohio.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, this takes me back to the history, Jim. When we started, it was just the mothers. We started WEBA, we were talking to each other, we were working with congressmen, we were doing things on Capitol Hill, we were asked to provide testimony for affidavits for the Supreme Court. It was all the mothers in the early stages. It was many of us coming forward, some of us in better mental health than others, offering our testimony before Congress, being a part of testifying in court cases about parental notification laws and informed consent laws, but there were no fathers visible. But within by the 1990s, about 10 years later, a few troubled but brave men started to emerge, and they offered their stories. They offered their experiences. I have in my office a copy of anybody remember U.S. News and World Report? Remember that was on the newsstands? They did an entire issue on the effect of abortion on individuals. And I was in it, a friend of mine was in it, 2 women that I work with, and 1 gentleman, and a couple of pro-abortion, some women who thought they were still pro-abortion. And it shocked people that men were speaking about their abortion experiences. So not only do men have a role to play in the movement, we cannot forget that every baby that dies is a member of, the slogan for American victims of abortion is, we are the mothers, the fathers, the families. They were our children. And so to realize that each baby that dies is a member of a family is important. The question is saying, you know, well, can men speak about it in general? I did a show last year that's been running on EWTN called When They Say, You Say, and we talk about that. We talk about the hard, okay, when all else fails, pro-abortion people will say, you're a man, you can't talk about it. You know, you're not,
You hate women.
You're 75 years old, lady, you're not going to have any more kids. Okay, when it, you know, you have that kind of thing. And that's an ad hominem attack. So I always say, look, the answer is, I'm a human being.
Right.
I care about the homeless. I care about drug abuse in our country. I care about how we're going to provide for the needy. I care about how we're responding to women who find themselves in a crisis pregnancy. So the answer is, this is a human rights issue, and as a human being, I have to be involved.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, be sure to purchase the EWTN mini-series, When They Say, You Say, which is hosted by Olivia. And it's item number, excuse me, HDWTS. You could purchase that on EWTNRC.com or call 1-800-854-6316.
Olivia, thank you so much for being with us. You're just an amazing spokesperson for the gospel of life. And let us all know down deep in our hearts and in reality that life prevails over death. God bless you and all of your loved ones. Bye now.